Olá, sou Wagner Azevedo, do IHU. Sejam todas e todos muito bem-vindos e muito bem-vindas a mais um evento do Instituto Humanitas, Unisinos e IHU. Hoje recebemos os professores Todd Salzman e Michael Lawler, que apresentarão a conferência A Igreja e União de Pessoas do Mesmo Sexo, o Responsum e seus impactos pastorais. Vou apresentar agora os professores. Primeiro, o professor Todd Salzman. O professor Salzman fez seu doutorado em teologia na Universidade Católica de Louvain, na Bélgica, concluiu sua tese em 1994, lecionou na Universidade de San Diego de 1995 a 1997 e foi para Creighton em 1997. Publicou 8 livros e mais de uma centena de artigos científicos e faz numerosas palestras em conferências nacionais e internacionais. Seu ensaio Rape Camps, Forced Impregnation and Ethnic Cleansing, Religious, Cultural and Ethical Response to Rape Victims in the Former Yugoslavia, ou, em tradução livre, Campos de Estupro, Fecundação Forçada e Limpeza Étnica, Reações Religiosas, Culturais e Éticas a Vítimas de Estupro na ex-Yugoslávia, obteve reconhecimento por parte das Nações Unidas e várias organizações não governamentais em Nova York em 2001. Em 2015, ele recebeu o prêmio por sua atividade de pesquisa na Universidade de Creighton. Michael Lawler é professor emérito da Creighton University, é graduado em matemática pela Universidade de Dublin e em teologia pela Pontifícia Universidade Gregoriana de Roma. É PhD em teologia sistemática pelo Instituto Aquinas de Teologia em St. Louis. Escreveram em coautoria os livros A Pessoa Sexual, por uma Antropologia Católica Renovada, publicado em português pela editora Unisinos, em 2012, Sexual Ethics, A Theological Introduction, publicado pela Georgetown Press, The Church in the Modern World, Gaudium Past, Then and Now, publicado em 2004. Livros esses que receberam prêmios da Associação da Imprensa Católica. Anunciamos que hoje estamos disponibilizando em nosso site o texto desta conferência em português, publicado no Cadernos Teologia Pública, edição 153. Está livre e acessível na nossa página principal do IHU. Lawler e Salzman também publicaram no Cadernos Teologia Pública os seguintes artigos: O Papa Francisco, a Igreja e a Ética Teológica. Alguma coisa mudou neste ano. E também, em 2015, publicaram Amoris Laetitia, Aspectos Antropológicos e Metodológicos e suas implicações para a teologia moral. Os dois professores também nos concederam algumas entrevistas. Destacamos Papa Francisco e a mudança na teologia moral, da ética sexual para a ética social, e também por uma nova moralidade sexual, esta em 2013. Entre vários artigos publicados em português, pelo IHU, traduzidos para o português pelo IHU, destacamos apenas um mais recente, que é A Igreja Católica Precisa Ouvir Transgêneros e Intersexuais. Sem mais delongas, professores, passo para vocês a palavra, fiquem à vontade. Convidamos a todos também para nos enviar perguntas pelo chat, participar pelo chat, que ao final da exposição dos professores, que durará em torno de 40 a 45 minutos, repassamos as perguntas e depois seguimos com o debate. Muito obrigado. Professor Todd Salzman, professor Michael Lawler, muito obrigado pela presença, novamente no IHU, uma grande parceria, e que seja um evento enriquecedor para nós. Sejam muito bem-vindos e fiquem à vontade.
Well, thank you very much, Wagner. We're very happy to be here with you, and thank you all for joining us. Michael and I talked, and I'm going to read the presentation, and then we'll both do Q&A. So I'll just get started. On March 15th, 2021, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican's doctrinal watchdog, issued a responsum to a question regarding a proposal by the German Bishops' Conference and Germany's largest Catholic lay organization, Zentralkomitee der Deutschen Katholiken, to bless of same-sex civil unions. The responsum does several things. It emphasizes again God's unconditional love for all people, reiterates church teaching about the morality of homosexual acts, and insists that not blessing same-sex unions is not a form of, quote, unjust discrimination, unquote. The responsum, in our judgment, is a morally distorted statement that God, quote, does not and cannot bless sin, unquote, slanders lesbian and gay persons who follow their well-formed consciences, and promotes discrimination and even violence against them. We first explain our judgment in this paper and then detail the pastoral implications of the responsum that provide hope for LGBTQ people in the church. So first, the distinction between objectively wrong and subjectively sinful acts. The CDF's position that a homosexual union is sinful because it objectively contravenes God's law conflates two situations that the church's moral teaching holds distinct, namely, the situation of an objectively wrong act or material sin, and the situation of a subjectively evil act or formal sin. Only formal sin is actually sin. One can judge an act wrong, killing an innocent person, but that does not mean the person is subjectively culpable. A hunter accidentally shoots another hunter. The CDF attempts to avoid this conflation in its commentary on the Responsum, where it clearly distinguishes between, quote, persons and the same-sex unions, unquote, and asserts that, quote, the negative judgment on the blessing of unions of persons of the same sex, material sin, does not imply judgment on persons, formal sin, unquote. The judgment of the Responsum, however, that God does not and cannot bless sin, implies a judgment on acts and persons. For the judgment is based on the prior judgment that the union is sinful because the acts of the person in the union are judged sinful. Acts and persons, the church itself teaches, are judged together in God's final judgment. And the CDF's claim to separate the two in the Responsum is disingenuous. It assumes that all same-sex civil unions are sinful because the homosexual acts done in them are sinful. It fails to recognize a basic Catholic moral distinction between an objectively wrong act and a subjectively evil act that is sinful. We consider each in turn. So first of all, homosexual acts objectively wrong, question mark. Tradition teaches that homosexual acts are, quote, intrinsically disordered, unquote, though it is more accurate to label them objectively wrong. There's a problem with the church's language on this for the following reasons. They are, quote, contrary to the natural law, unquote, the principles of which are reflected in human nature itself. They close the sexual act to the gift of life, and they do not proceed from a genuine, effective, and sexual complementarity. We consider each of these teachings in turn. So first of all, the natural law argument. Every human being has a nature that is always interpreted and socially constructed by reason. There may be, therefore, and are different cultural interpretations of what constitutes human nature. The meaning of the phrase sexual orientation as part of nature is not universally agreed upon, but the Catholic Church distinguishes between a homosexual tendency, which proves to be transitory, and homosexuals who are definitively such because of some kind of innate instinct. It goes on to declare that it seems appropriate to understand sexual orientation as a deep-seated dimension of one's personality or nature, and to recognize its relative stability in a person. Sexual orientation is predominantly heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. This natural, historically, socially, and experientially revealed reality may be obscured by the statistical preponderance of persons of heterosexual orientation, but it is in no way negated by that statistical preponderance. We are in complete agreement with the CDF when it teaches that, quote, there can be no true promotion of man and woman's dignity unless the essential order of his and her nature is respected, unquote. We disagree with the CDF, however, on its exclusively heterosexual interpretation of that essential order of human nature. Humans have no access to pure, unembellished nature. They know common nature only by abstraction from the experiential fact of individuals. Everything beyond that experiential fact is a result of interpretation by attentive, intelligent, rational, and responsible persons. We experience nature only as rationally interpreted and socially constructed. Our sexual anthropology then recognizes sexual orientation as an intrinsic dimension of both human individual and human nature, and is accepted as natural sexual activity will vary depending upon whether a person's orientation is homosexual or heterosexual. Homosexual acts are natural for people with a homosexual orientation. Heterosexual acts are natural for people with a heterosexual orientation. They are natural because they reflect the person's fundamental human nature as understood by right reason. We aren't to be understood as arguing here that homosexual activity is ethical simply because it is natural for those with a homosexual orientation, that'd be to commit the natural fallacy. To be ethical, we stipulate every sexual act, homosexual or heterosexual, must be not only natural, but also free, just, loving, and respectful of the human dignity and flourishing of both individual partners. The procreation argument. We consider second the claim that homosexual acts close the sexual act to the gift of life. If one explores the Catholic Church's concept of openness to the transmission of life in biological terms, then potentially reproductive and permanently or temporally non-reproductive heterosexual acts are essentially different types of acts. The sterile person's genitals, Andrew Koppelman points out, are no more suitable for generation than a gun with a broken firing pin is suitable for shooting. It is a conceptual stretch, he goes on, to insist that the sexual acts of the incurably infertile are of the same kind as the sexual acts of fertile organs that occasionally fail to deliver the goods. Both gays and lesbians are naturally sexed human beings, and their sexual activity is as incurably infertile as the acts of permanently infertile married heterosexuals, which the Catholic Church recognizes as legitimate and ethical. If we explore openness to the transmission of life, not in biological, but in metaphorical relational terms, then both homosexual and heterosexual couples can exhibit just and loving significance in their unions and sexual acts. We consider third, the Church's teaching that gay and lesbian acts do not proceed from a genuine, affective, and sexual complementarity. The Church consistently condemns homosexual acts as objectively wrong on the grounds that they violate homosexual and reproductive complementarity, but it never attempts to explain why they also violate personal complementarity, other than to assert with no supporting evidence that they do not proceed from a genuine, affective, and sexual complementarity. The Church may nowhere have confronted this question of effective complementarity, but monogamous, just, loving, mutually committed homosexual couples have confronted it experientially. And they testify that they do experience effective and personal complementarity in and through their homosexual acts. Margaret Farley notes that the experiential testimonies of such couples witness to the role of such loves and relationships in sustaining human well-being and opening to human flourishing. This coincides precisely with our foundational principle on the immediate and mediate relational impact of truly human sexual acts. Expressed in a manner which is truly human, Gaudium et Spes writes, these actions signify and promote that mutual self-giving by which spouses immediately enrich each other and immediately enrich their family and community with a joyful and a thankful will. Years ago, while acknowledging that the question of same-sex relations is a question of dispute, Farley, focusing on experience as source of ethical knowledge, noted the anecdotal experiences of homosexual couples and commented that we have some clear and profound testimonies to the life-enhancing possibilities of same-sex relations and the integrating possibilities of sexual activities within these relations. We have the witness that homosexuality can be a way of embodying responsible love and sustaining human friendship. She concludes logically that this witness alone is enough to demand of the Christian community that it reflect anew on the norms for homosexual love. Her judgment accords with that of Bernard Rannigan, a gay consulting psychotherapist, who notes that the gap between the caricature of us gays in church documents and our lived reality seems so huge. He asks legitimately, on what evidence does the Vatican base its assertions about us? And goes on to point out that psychoanalysis has moved on from being solely concerned with genital sex to thinking much more about human relationships and love, a focus or a shift to personalism, fundamentally. So too has Catholic theological ethics. Lawrence Kurdick has supported Farley's anecdotal evidence with extensive research data on gay and lesbian couples that demonstrate social scientifically that they tend to have a more equitable distribution of household labor, demonstrate greater conflict resolution skills, have less support from members of their families, but greater support from friends, and most significantly, experience similar levels of relational satisfaction compared to heterosexual couples. On the basis of this supporting evidence, we conclude this section by endorsing Farley's judgment. Sex between two persons of the same sex, just as between two persons of the opposite sex, should not be used in a way that exploits, objectifies, or dominates. Homosexual, like heterosexual rape, violence, or any harmful use of power against unwilling victims or those incapacitated by reason of age, is never justified. Freedom, integrity, privacy are values to be affirmed in every homosexual as heterosexual relationship. All in all, individuals are not to be harmed and the common good is to be promoted. French theologian Xavier Lacroix explains that all Catholic theological ethics accept that ethics can have for its object only acts that are free, acts that can be imputed to personal responsibility. Whatever is determined insofar as it is determined is neither moral nor immoral. It simply is. Heterosexual orientation is an innate and stable orientation to predominantly persons of the opposite sex. Homosexual orientation is a similarly innate and stable orientation to predominantly persons of the same sex. Sexual orientation is neither chosen nor easily changeable. It simply is. It is therefore in itself neither ethical nor unethical. The sexual acts that flow from it, however, may be objectively right or wrong according to their circumstances. Sexual acts, homosexual or heterosexual, are right when they are natural, reasonable, free, and expressed in a truly human, just, and loving manner that promotes human dignity and human flourishing. Homosexual acts, subjectively sinful, question mark. The responsum is theologically distorted because while it is true that God does not and cannot bless sin, it is not true that all those in same-sex relationships are necessarily living in sin. Since the church's arguments to justify the claim that homosexual acts are objectively wrong are debated theologically, as argued above, even if we concede that Catholic teaching on the objective wrongness of homosexual acts is correct, however, it is not necessarily the case that such acts are formally sinful. There is a well-established Catholic theological argument that rejects this claim. In his exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis teaches that material poverty drives people into de facto unions and other irregular situations, such as same-sex civil unions that do not fully carry out the objective demands of the law, and that it can no longer simply be said that all those in any irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin and are deprived of sanctifying grace. Those teachings seriously challenge the responsum's underlying presumption that those living in irregular same-sex unions and engaging in sexual intercourse are living in a state of mortal sin. Francis here is doing no more than exemplifying concretely the abstract teaching of the Catechism that affective immaturity, force of acquired habit, conditions of anxiety, or other psychological or social factors lessen or even extenuate moral culpability. In other words, one may perform an objectively wrong act but not be morally culpable of formal sin. The responsum agrees with Pope Francis that God loves every person and the church does the same. That statement is undeniably true of God, for God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him, and also in her. It is not always true of the church, which more often condemns than praises all homosexuals and refuses to rejoice with them and celebrate the presence of God in their lives. To put the idea that God loves and abides in all who love God in catechism terms, all who love God are in the presence of God and in the state of sanctifying grace, including lesbian, gay, women and men individually and as just and loving couples. The teaching of the responsum is simply and explicitly wrong. Not all couples in same-sex unions are living in sin. The authority and inviolability of conscience is central to interpreting and understanding the responsum and church tradition. Objectively wrong acts and subjectively sinful acts are held distinct in the moral teaching of the church. The CDF ignores that teaching, and in ignoring it, also ignores the authority and inviolability of well-formed conscience, which one must follow, even if, as theologian Joseph Ratzinger, become Pope Benedict XVI, famously taught, it goes against what the church teaches, objectively contravenes God's law. Pope Francis complains that, quote, we find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations, unquote. He goes on to insist that we have been called to form consciences, not to replace them. Already in the 13th century, theologian Thomas Aquinas established the authority and violability of conscience. Anyone, he argues, upon whom the ecclesiastical authorities, in ignorance of the true facts, imposes a demand that offends against his clear conscience, should perish in excommunication rather than violate his conscience. For any Catholic in search of the good and the true, no clear statement on the authority and inviolability of personal conscience could be found. Aquinas goes further and insists that even the dictate, excuse me, of an invincibly ignorant conscience must be followed, and that to act against such a dictate is formally sinful. 700 years later, the last 100 of which saw the rights of individual conscience essentially ignored in the Catholic Church, the Second Vatican Council's Gaudium et Spes issued a clarion call with respect to conscience. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his death. In a wonderful manner, conscience reveals that law, which is fulfilled by love of God and neighbor. Dignitatis Humanae, the Council's decree on religious freedom, went further to assert the inviolability of conscience. In all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience faithfully in order that he may come to God for whom he was created. It follows that he is not to be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor, on the other hand, is he to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience, especially in matters religious or, we add, ethical. In the 1960s, these were words seldom voiced in Catholic magisterial circles, but they are words deeply rooted in the Catholic moral tradition and indeed constitutive of it. Conscience, we insist, is not a law unto itself. It must be as fully informed as possible to be correct. That formation is the process from gathering the necessary evidence, discerning the evidence, to making the practical judgment that this is what I must do in this situation at this time. When that process is followed, even if conscience is in error, one has a moral obligation to follow a judgment of conscience. Joseph Ratzinger concurs, quote, over the Pope as the expression of the binding claim of ecclesiastical authority, there still stands one's conscience, which must be obeyed before all else, if necessary, even against the requirement of ecclesiastical authority. Conscience confronts the individual with a supreme and ultimate tribunal, and one which in last resort is beyond the claim of external social groups, even of the official church, unquote. Very powerful statement. This statement affirms the church's teaching on conscience and fundamentally challenges Responsum, which conflates its judgment on the objective wrongness of homosexual acts and the sin of persons performing those acts, and in doing so, denies the authority and inviolability of their consciences. Unjust discrimination. Although the clerical sex abuse scandal and its cover-up are the most well-known and acknowledged instances of sexual and spiritual violence in the church today, there are other types of violence that are not as well acknowledged. One of these is evident in church documents that state, as does the Responsum and Catechism with regard to homosexual persons, that the church rejects, quote, all unjust discrimination, unquote, towards them. Talk of unjust discrimination against homosexuals immediately raised the question of possible just discrimination against them. And the responsum is at pains to suggest that its refusal to bless persons who love God and whom God loves is not, and it is not intended to be, a form of unjust discrimination against them. How could it not be unjust discrimination, we ask, when women and men who love God and are in just, loving, faithful relationships are deprived of the blessing of God they deserve and, like the rest of us, need? The Catholic teaching that the homosexual inclination is objectively disordered and that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered underlie, enable, and legitimate the violence of this so-called just discrimination against lesbians and gays. These teachings suggest that homosexual orientation is such a departure from the heterosexual norm embraced by the church that gays and lesbians and intersex people are less than fully human, less than real men and women, and so physical and spiritual violence can be done to them without any moral blame. Since it adds nothing to establish Catholic moral doctrines, the responsum is unnecessary, serves only to slander people who, based on a well-formed conscience, are in just, mutual, loving, same-sex relationship, and promotes discrimination against them. The responsum and pastoral responses, grounds for hope. Though the responsum is unnecessary and profoundly hurtful and alienating to LGBTQ brothers and sisters, their families and friends, and the people of God, there are several reasons for hope, clearly evident in the German bishops' conferences promoting the blessing of same-sex civil unions and Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia. First of all, the German Bishops' Conference. On the first day of Advent 2019, the German Bishops' Conference inaugurated a 2-year project, which they called the Synodal Way, with a meeting with members from the Bishops' Conference and Germany's largest lay organization, Central Committee der Deutschen Katholiken. This project, both the inclusion and active involvement of lay voices in it and the infrastructure to support it, represents a move toward Pope Francis's synodal paradigm shift and Vatican II's communion ecclesiology. The synodal path facilitates greater dialogue between scholars, laity, and clerical members of the church to promote concrete synodality. Pope Francis has himself modeled commitment to such a synodal dialogue. Dialogue, he teaches, is born from an attitude of respect for the other person, from a conviction that the person has something good to say. It assumes that there is room in the heart for the other person's point of view and proposal. To dialogue entails a cordial reception of the other, not a prior condemnation. In order to dialogue, it is necessary to know how to lower the defenses, open the doors of the house, and offer a human warmth. Excuse me. In a courageous ecclesiological move to embody synodality, the German bishops have created the infrastructure to realize this synodal paradigm shift and to explore lay and episcopal perspectives that challenge Catholic sexual teachings in general and church teaching on homosexuality in specific. The unity that we seek, Francis explains, is not uniformity, but a unity in diversity or reconciled diversity. It is out of this synodal process that the German Bishops' Conference proposed blessing same-sex civil unions and provoked an anonymous question to the CDF and its responsum to that question. Bishop George Batzing, president of the German Bishops' Conference, recently expressed the need for, quote, intense confrontation, unquote, in the church on the question of blessing same-sex unions and other sexual ethical issues. Quote, people in homosexual partnerships want the blessing of the church, one that is not concealed. They want the church to hold their life in such value that they are given the blessing of God and not denied it. I believe that we must evaluate homosexuality and life partnerships outside of marriage in a new way, unquote. He continues, quote, we can no longer go on the assumption of natural law alone, but must think much more strongly in such categories as caring and responsibility for one another, unquote. He concludes with a very hopeful note, quote, a change in blessing same-sex unions is pending, unquote. In defiance of the CDF's Responsum, more than 100 German priests participated in blessing same-sex unions in May 2021. Bishop Botzing's position is in line with and affirmed by Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia. Just a quick comment here. Bishop Botzing wasn't happy that over 100 priests throughout Germany blessed same-sex civil unions publicly, but it wasn't that they were blessing those unions publicly that was the problem. It was that it was a reaction through in a form of dissent to the Responsum. And so he fully affirms that same-sex couples should receive a blessing. Pope Francis and Amoris Laetitia. First, Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna judges that Amoris Laetitia is the great text of moral theology that we have been waiting for since the days of the Second Vatican Council, and that it signals an organic development of doctrine, which includes continuity and innovation of doctrine. Francis provides continuity of doctrine by openly acknowledging and defending the anthropological dignity of gay and lesbian persons, emphasizing that they should be treated with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. He offers innovation by not condemning their unions. All he does in Amoris Laetitia is to state that their unions may not be equated with traditional heterosexual marriage, which is far from a condemnation. He offers a traditional Catholic teaching of procreation as a primary end of marriage as his reason for judging that same-sex unions cannot be equated with traditional marriage. No union that is closed to the transmission of life can ensure the future of society. It is now over 50 years since Vatican II refused to declare procreation the primary end of marriage and taught rather that procreation and the fostering of the union of the spouses were equal ends, but that teaching has not yet been fully incorporated into the Church's sexual anthropology. There is an indication in Amoris Laetitia that Francis is moving innovatively in that theological direction when he singles out criticism, the presentation of marriage in such a way that its unitive meaning, its call to grow in love, and its ideal of mutual assistance is overshadowed by an almost exclusive insistence on the duty of procreation. His emphasis on the unitive meaning of marriage shows his theology moving organically to the theological conclusion that the procreative and unitive ends of marriage are equal. When that position becomes fully accepted by a majority in the church, which the statistics show has already happened, the procreative argument against same-sex marriage will be no more. Second, Pope Francis's new pastoral methods in Amoris Laetitia promote innovation since they require that different communities will have to devise more practical and effective initiatives that respect both the church's teaching and local problems and needs. In one sense, his current and past support for the legalization of same-sex civil unions is innovative and puts him at odds with the official sexual doctrine of the Catholic Church, which teaches, again, that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered and under no circumstances can they be approved. In another sense, Francis's new pastoral methods flow from church social teaching that promotes human dignity, opposes all discrimination, and teaches that homosexual people must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. In continuity with church teaching, Pope Francis neither accepts nor promotes the marriage of same-sex couples in the church, and his defense of civil unions is aimed at protecting heterosexual marriage and its privileges, as well as the dignity of rights and rights of LGBTQ couples. He recognizes and promotes legal protections for human dignity in both civil and church law. His pastoral statements defending same-sex civil unions should be read as an attempt to balance those two realities in a way that promotes human dignity, welcomes members of the LGBTQ community into the church family, and treats them with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Third, Pope Francis's new pastoral methods, which address different communities' problems and needs, offers hope for another reason. Same-sex marriage is now civil law in most of the Western world, and both the experiential and social scientific evidence is that Christian gay and lesbian civil marriages are as humanly and Christianly fulfilling as the marriages of heterosexuals. As more and more Catholics recognize the moral legitimacy of same-sex marriage, and statistics show that a near majority of Western Catholics already do so, the innovation of blessing those marriages will become as accepted as the formerly prohibited mixed marriage. Fourth, Francis is bringing to the fore and prioritizing the traditional Catholic doctrine on the authority and inviolability of personal conscience is fully in line with the Catholic tradition. His innovation is to grant that authority and inviolability of personal conscience to every moral decision both heterosexuals and homosexuals make. It applies, therefore, to the free conscience decisions of Catholic homosexuals to marry as much as it applies to any other moral decision. Conclusion. The CDF's Responsum is a morally distorted statement that God does not and cannot bless sin. It slanders lesbian and gay persons who are living their lives and loving their God, following their well-formed consciences, and promotes discrimination against them. Despite the pain it has caused, however, it also indicates hope for change in the church. Such change generally occurs through tension, conflict, and, in Pope Francis's papacy, synodal dialogue. The Responsum exemplifies this tension. The synodal way, public debate, and passionate disagreement among bishops, priests, and the faithful, and defiance of the Responsum by many German Catholic priests who publicly bless same-sex unions all indicate that, in the words of Bishop Batzing, change is pending. Hopeful words indeed. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Muito obrigado, professor Todd Salzman, professor Michael Lawler. Prazer contar com vocês. Agora convido o professor Michael Lawler também para se juntar ao debate. Eu tenho algumas perguntas aqui. Eu vou começar com referindo-se primeiro a um artigo recente de vocês. Vocês citam a necessidade de pastores corajosos para abrir a porta que o Papa Francisco tem deixado entreaberta para acolher uma nova moral sexual para a igreja. Mas e a colocação que eu faço é que há pastores corajosos em muitas paróquias e dioceses. Mas estariam esses pastores em locais errados ou são poucos em números?
The people who are open to same-sex unions, is that the question?
Yeah, pastors that are, some of the pastors that are blessing them or open to them, yeah.
You mentioned the word courageous, and I have a comment to make about that. Courage and courageous actions are frequently a form of prophecy. That means that the action that is viewed as courageous points in a direction that is not the present direction of the church. Prophets have always been troublesome. There's no question about that. You simply read Isaiah and Jeremiah in the Old Testament. But yes, so my answer is yes. These pastors who are blessing same-sex unions are making a courageous statement. And their statement is, there is absolutely no moral problem involved in a same-sex union. The implication from the CDF that those in civil unions are living in sin is simply wrong. Not only wrong in my judgment, but wrong in the judgment of the church. As we explained in the paper, there is a clear distinction between an action that is objectively wrong or materially wrong and an action that is sinful. And the church clearly acknowledges that distinction, and those who are blessing same-sex unions are acting on that same judgment. They are courageous in the sense that they are standing against the church's official position that homosexual acts are disordered. And that, in my judgment, is a clear prophetic statement.
Yeah, I fully concur with Mike on that. And I would add that one of the reasons I think more priests are not speaking out, and it highlights the link between ecclesiology and moral theology, is that Pope Francis's synodality hasn't been incorporated into the very infrastructure of the church. So I think many more priests would speak out on this, but they fear repercussions. And especially in the US, synodality is struggling. The bishops don't want to hear it, many of them. There are some very courageous bishops speaking out on this and other issues, but they're suppressed in their vote by the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So until the ecclesiology fully integrates and accepts that infrastructure, I think you're going to have what appears to be a limited number of voices. Obviously, not all priests support this, but a more limited number out of fear of repercussions. And the gospel shouldn't be guided by fear, but unfortunately, that's one aspect of a human institution that doesn't embrace the church on a journey and synodality.
And courage is the remedy for fear.
Muito obrigado, professores. Eu quero, antes de repassar as próximas perguntas, eu quero só relembrar aos espectadores que o texto da palestra está em português no nosso site, é o Cadernos Teologia Pública número 153, que tem o mesmo título da palestra que está no YouTube e nos cards de divulgação. A pergunta que eu repasso agora, que chegou pelo nosso chat. O que pensam a respeito do abandono de intelectuais e jovens católicos que estão deixando a igreja por causa de sua homofobia institucional e doutrinal? A igreja não se importa com essas saídas?
That's an excellent question. The sociological data indicates that many people are leaving the church, and more troubling, many younger people, the under 30s, many of them are leaving the church because of the sexual abuse scandal and nothing being done about it, essentially. And also the churches, because of the church's negative sexual teachings, not only about homosexual acts, but about contraception and about divorced and remarried, communion for divorced and remarried. Does anybody care? Oh, yes. Many people care. Many bishops care. Many Catholics care. And many do not. In his pontificate, Pope Benedict XVI said on one occasion that the result of all those people leaving the church will be a small committed community, a small committed church that would be prophetic in this world. We ought to care. We ought always to care for our neighbors. I think that's fairly clear in the gospel.
Yeah, and I think in driving people away from the church, especially young people, as Mike indicated, it demonstrates that the church is still struggling with how to incorporate the authority and inviolability of conscience into its doctrinal teaching, and to respect the authority of that conscience and the conclusions that it reaches, and to prioritize that doctrine over specific sexual ethical teachings. And I think we think, as articulated in the article, that Pope Francis is trying to do this, but he's running up against great resistance to this, which is a resistance to the best of the Catholic tradition on the authority and inviolability of conscience. And until that question is resolved, at least in part, I think you're going to continue to have people who leave the church out of disgust because they have family, friends, relatives, loved ones who are LGBTQ members or themselves are, and they don't feel welcome in the church. And that's extremely tragic, I find.
The problem of losing young people is ultimately that you lose also their future children. And the church, rather than growing, is diminishing.
Uma outra pergunta, também nos chegou pelo chat, é assim: como podemos reconhecer o significado da relação homossexual com base em um paradigma relacional que favoreça o reconhecimento da autenticidade da relação homoafetiva?
The introduction of the word relationship is crucial. In Catholic theological ethics, the tradition was to focus on acts, acts like stealing, lying, sexual intercourse, to focus on the acts. And that, of course, was supported and and encouraged by confession, the sacrament of penance. When you went to confession 20 years ago, say, what did you confess? You confessed acts. I lied, I stole, I murdered. These acts, without any explanation of why. Why did this happen? What drove me to do this? In contemporary Catholic theological ethics, the focus is moving away from acts to relationships. That's why it's so important that you introduce the word relationship, that relation to neighbor is critical. Relation to neighbors is critical. Much more important than this act or that act or this other specific act. And the question in our minds, the question about gay lesbian unions is the question about relationship. What is the relationship here? We mentioned in the paper that the church now makes a distinction between what it calls transitory homosexuals and definitive homosexuals, those who are definitively homosexual. Think about that. The transitory homosexual in his or her sexual activity, what is he seeking? He's seeking his self-pleasure. It's a selfish activity, not very good for relationships. The definitive homosexual, on the other hand, those who are entering into definitive homosexual unions, what are they aiming at? They are aiming at affirming, loving, sustaining, supporting another human being. The union is wide open to affirming relationship and to enabling it to grow. And in Catholic theological ethics today, that's an absolutely critical transition from a focus on acts to a focus on relationships.
The burden of proof is on the church to prove its claim that by definition, same-sex acts are destructive of human dignity. Ultimately, it's grounded in an anthropology, a heterosexual reproductive act anthropology. And so the burden of proof is on the church to establish its claims experientially, as we indicated in the paper. That claim is discounted sociologically, experientially, in the lives of committed same-sex couples. So the church can claim whatever it wants is true, but it has to justify those claims both with scientific evidence, experiential evidence, and when there's a disconnect, and this raises the issue of the relationship between science and theology, when there's a disconnect between what science and experience tell us and what the tradition teaches, we can't just say, well, if it contradicts what the church teaches, the science is wrong. We have to engage in dialogue. And John Paul II supported that dialogue, but he didn't like to follow through if the conclusions reached contradicted the norms of the church. And this is one good example where the relationship between loving same-sex couples doesn't coincide with the church's claims about the damage that those relationships do individually, in terms of the couple and in terms of the community.
Uma outra pergunta que recebemos.
The church's claim that homosexual activity does not affirm dignity, growth, relationship, etc., is probably true for those homosexuals that are said to be transitory. They're not fully committed, but it is certainly not true for those homosexuals that are defined as definitive.
Uma outra pergunta é sobre o termo usado no Responsum, no título do Responsum, digamos assim, ou na escrita do Responsum. O título do Responsum reforça o paradigma naturalista ao referir união de pessoas do mesmo sexo. Por que não uniões homoafetivas, no sentido da complementariedade afetiva? Mas falar de relação entre pessoas do mesmo sexo é diferente de falar em relação homoafetiva, que sinaliza a complementariedade afetiva que vocês citam.
Can I get a clarification? When you say homo-affective, is that focused on affective meaning the relationship and a positive assessment of that?
Isso seria uma relação homoafetiva que sinaliza a complementariedade afetiva. Aqui no Brasil é um termo já utilizado legalmente para se dizer relação entre pessoas do mesmo sexo, digamos, né? Se formos usar esse paradigma naturalista. Mas isso acabaria incluindo também outras formas, outras identidades de gênero também, né? O termo homoafetivo. Então, o Responsum, ao utilizar pessoas do mesmo sexo, não está reafirmando um paradigma naturalista?
The use of the phrase same-sex relationship in the Responsum is simply being faithful to the church's tradition. That's the way the church talks about it. You back up a little bit. What relationship does the church traditionally affirm between a man and a woman? The answer to that is heterosexual marriage. A man and a woman may commit to one another and engage in sexual intercourse for the purpose of procreation. That was the ancient tradition. The Second Vatican Council expanded that for the purpose of procreation and the mutual affirmation of the spouses, the affirmation of their mutual dignity, mutual equality, etc. The terminology same-sex relationship or same-sex union is intended to indicate that it is not heterosexual and it is not procreative. And since it is not heterosexual and procreative, there is something disordered about it. That's the word they use. It's disordered. The CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, argues that it's actually pathological. There is something diseased about it. And the continual use of that terminology, same-sex union, same-sex act, same-sex activity, is specifically intended to raise that vision of being disordered, of being somehow pathological. It may be that it's naturalistic. It's naturalistic in the sense that heterosexual marriage is taken to be nature's norm, and same-sex unions are, quotes, contrary to nature's norms. They are disordered, they are pathological, they need to be cured somehow. And I may add, of course, that the evidence for the scientific evidence is that definitive homosexuals cannot be cured. There is nothing pathological about them. They are just a different type of human being.
Certo. Nós recebemos mais algumas perguntas. Eu posso lhe fazer mais duas e encerramos?
Ok.
Ok. Professor César Kuzma enviou a seguinte pergunta. Vocês poderiam dar uma palavra sobre a adoção de crianças por casais homoafetivos? Vejo como um ato de amor, mas grupos conservadores veem com resistência em alguns lugares, também tem desafios jurídicos. Como podemos avançar nesta reflexão?
A very good question and a very presently relative one. It is yes, the opposition to same-sex couples adopting children is fairly widespread. Widespread in the world, I mean. The argument that the CDF makes is that any child adopted by a same-sex couple will be somehow damaged. A gay couple, they will be lacking a mother. In a lesbian couple, they will be lacking a father. And the absence of that mother relationship or father relationship will somehow damage the children. Most importantly, the scientific evidence. Same-sex couples have in fact adopted children, and the scientific evidence is that those children grow up in exactly the same way as children in heterosexual marriages. There is some very interesting evidence that the children of same-sex couples betray or manifest or show a greater emotional attachment or a greater emotional openness to other human beings than do the children of heterosexual couples. Very interesting evidence. At the moment, I must add, at the moment, that evidence is just beginning to be known. There aren't that many same-sex couples adopting children, and so the numbers are small, and the evidence from those small numbers needs to be replicated down through the years to become stabilized. But the preliminary evidence is that there is absolutely no problem in same-sex couples or couples in same-sex unions adopting children. The preliminary evidence about the children is very positive. And the argument that they are somehow damaged by their adoption, the argument offered by the CDF, and the argument offered by some Catholic thinkers simply doesn't stand up to scientific examination. And as we mentioned in the paper, Pope John Paul argued that the relationship between science and theology should be encouraged. That's what he believed theoretically. Practically, he did nothing about it.
Sim, vamos lá. A última pergunta é a seguinte. Pensando um pouco a reforma da Cúria, que se diz para sair este ano, 2021, nesta reforma, o que poderia ser mudado no papel da congregação para a doutrina da fé?
Oh, my goodness gracious me. I am now 88 years old. Ever since I knew about the Roman Curia, there has been talk about reforming it. So, Francis has talked about reforming the Curia. It will not come as a surprise to hear that those most opposed to reforming the Curia are the curial ministers themselves. They like the power. It's a very human reaction. They like the power, and they want to keep the power. Francis has faced that reaction since he became Pope, and since he started talking about the synodal way, he has met great Roman opposition. He has made some moves. If you ask about the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he replaced a very rigid president, if that's the word. That's not the word, but that's what it means. He replaced a very rigid president with a president who is more open, more open to the synodal way, more open to listening rather than authoritatively declaring. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing he would love to make the same changes elsewhere. At the moment, in the United States and Europe, and I presume also in Brazil, there has been much talk about corruption in the Vatican's financial office, and the Pope is trying to remedy that. Will it succeed? I have to believe it will succeed. We have to believe it will succeed. He has to believe it will succeed. we used the word earlier in this discussion, courageous. We all must be courageous. The Pope must be courageous. Our bishops must be courageous. And each of us individual Catholics must be courageous. Because in the synodal way, we all have a part to play. If it comes to fruition, we all have a part to play in the synodal way. And in relation to the question, we all have a part to, as part of the synodal way, we all have a part to play in the revision of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I'm sorry to have to leave you with, and I'm sorry to have to leave you with this statement. I can no longer escape my responsibility by saying it is up to them. We can no longer escape our responsibility by saying it is up to them, the bishops, the Vatican, the Pope. It is up to them, but only as part of us, only as part of the church that is communion, not the church that is hierarchical from the top down, but the church that is a communion. Any revision will happen to the extent that we are all part of it.
Muito obrigado, professor Michael Lawler. O professor Todd Salzman conseguiu entrar novamente?
We have a serious. Oh, he has returned.
Ele voltou.
I don't. Oh, there he is.
It is really unfortunate. We had a bad storm hit and it took out the internet, so I'm on my phone now. So.
Entendeu? Espero que esteja tudo bem aí com o senhor enfim, convido-lhe apenas para dar uma palavra de encerramento devido ao horário. Não sei se o senhor quer fazer alguma manifestação antes de encerrarmos.
Todd, I already said my piece. You have something to say?
Okay. You know, thanks so much for having us. Yeah, no, thank you very much for having us. It's a wonderful opportunity to dialogue and share thoughts. And I think the Responsum is unfortunate in so many ways, but I also find it very hopeful that bishops and priests and lay people are speaking out and not just shutting up and accepting the status quo and the erroneous statements of the Vatican on this issue. So it's very hopeful. I think synodality is playing itself out in and through this process, and it took something like the Responsum to throw down the gauntlet in a way, to give people courage to speak out and to do so within the church and to work to affect change. And I think we're gradually witnessing a transformation to synodality that will move the church forward, guided by the Holy Spirit in a way that's grounded in the fundamental principles of the Gospels and not distorted doctrines. So those are my conclusions.
You are repeating what I just finished with.
Well, good.
That
we think along the same lines often.
Yes. That
mais de uma década trabalhando juntos, não?
So there you go.
Yeah. My hair's even getting grayer. We're starting to look alike even a bit. And I'm getting more Irish, which is God's gift.
We are now finished. We have said everything that we know.
Novamente, então, muito obrigado, professor Michael Lawler, professor Todd Salzman. Em nome do IHU, agradeço por mais essa presença conosco. Reforçamos também ao público que confira a palestra, que ficará salva no YouTube, compartilhe com seus contatos, curta, se inscreva no nosso canal, assim gera mais engajamento, também maior visibilidade a essa discussão tão importante nos dias de hoje na igreja. E também reforçamos que o texto da palestra em português está acessível e livre no nosso site, no nosso webpage, e com o título com o mesmo título que está aqui no YouTube, na seção de publicações no Cadernos Teologia Pública, número 153. A continuação desse debate sobre o Responsum se dará no dia 21 de junho, em meio a conferências. Claro que em nosso site também a gente convida todos a assinar a newsletter, porque continuará o debate em forma de textos, mas em forma de conferência a gente segue com esse debate com o professor doutor André Grillo, do Pontifício Ateneu Santo Anselmo, no dia 21 de junho, às 16 horas, também pelo YouTube, e também com tradução simultânea do italiano para o português. No dia do evento, tentaremos disponibilizar também o link com a transmissão em italiano para quem quiser acompanhar. O título da palestra do professor André Grillo será o Responsum e a possibilidade de novas abordagens. Novamente, agradecemos a todos que nos acompanharam até aqui, agradecemos muito ao professor Lawler e ao professor Salzman, e que a gente possa continuar nessa discussão por algum tempo, de forma mais positiva e menos crítica, talvez. Tá bem? Muito obrigado e até a próxima.